Hi, family. Welcome back to this third and final session on the whims of kings and the wrath of God. I kicked off this series by sharing that if you're like me, you've wrestled with the relevance of the Old Testament from time to time. What recently drove me back into these ancient texts was a question from a close friend whose perspective I value deeply. They asked me, "Do you think God is wrathful?" That question came up several weeks ago in an adult Sunday school class where we were discussing the parables of Jesus through a video series by Reformed theologian R.C. Sproul. The same topic was on our minds again this week as we discussed the parable of the rich man and Lazarus and what happens when we die. People often have a hard time facing the reality that death is a point of no return, with no second chances. Jesus is clear in this parable that we will be judged, and that judgment is final. But the good news is that we will be judged by a completely righteous God, not by any of us. How does God's wrath relate to this final judgment? Again, I believe the story of the division and ultimate fall of the northern kingdom of Israel, also called Ephraim or Samaria, is one of the best windows we have into God's character. It shows us that God is both entirely righteous and remarkably patient, and that his wrath doesn't look like human temper tantrums. Human wrath is often emotional, reactive, and vengeful. But God's wrath is simply the expression of his perfect justice. They are one and the same. Let's finish the story of what happened to the northern kingdom. As you might recall, around 793 BC, the northern kingdom entered a 40-year economic golden age under King Jeroboam II. To outside observers, Israel looked prosperous and secure. But after Jeroboam II died in 753 BC, the bottom completely fell out. For the next 30 years, Israel, the northern kingdom, lived a chaotic death spiral. They had 6 kings in 20 years, 4 of whom were assassinated. Their leaders formed desperate alliances with Syria and Egypt to survive the rising power of Assyria, whom everyone feared. What we read in 2 Kings and Hosea is chilling. God simply steps back and lets human political maneuvering take over completely. Israel's leaders refused to seek divine protection. Instead, they scrambled to buy off brutal foreign kings until Assyria finally decides to write them off entirely. The tragic result, recorded in 2 Kings chapter 17, is that around 722 BC, the Assyrian kings Shalmaneser V and Sargon II led a vicious 3-year siege of Samaria. The northern kingdom was crushed, and the remnants of the 10 northern tribes were scattered across the Assyrian Empire, resulting in the total loss of their cultural and spiritual identity. This is what history calls the 10 lost tribes. After 250 years of patiently sending prophets, the end of the northern kingdom comes down to divine abandonment. God lets the people of Israel have their own way, and he lets Assyria be Assyria. Israel insisted on living by the rules of the world, and in the end, the world, with those rules, swallowed them whole. Now, this is the nature of God's wrath. This history, along with passages across the Old and New Testaments, including the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, shows us that God is entirely righteous and remarkably patient. And his wrath is simply giving us what we persistently choose for ourselves. We see the flip side of this in the story of Jonah. When Jonah finally goes to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, and preaches, the people actually repent. And because they turn back, God's wrath on Nineveh is withheld. C.S. Lewis summarized it best, as he so often did, when he wrote that in the end, there are only 2 kinds of people. Those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, in the end, "Thy will be done." This I believe. Aloha.